Hello and welcome to Miniature Adventures. I'm Big Lee, and this week I want to talk about the changing hobby, the move from skirmish games versus big battles. So this week I want to talk about the changing face of the hobby. I went to Salute last weekend and there was a lot of discussion at the event between gamers that I met at one of the panels afterwards and then after online about the predominance of small skirmish games instead of large big battles at the show. There was a distinct shift, it felt, towards smaller sci-fi and fantasy skirmish sized games this year with fewer big historical tables at the show. Now I've been thinking about this all week and decided it would be a good time to have a conversation now that everyone has had a week to absorb and to think about what they experienced at Salute. Now many of you will no doubt already have discussed this subject with your friends or online, so may already have come to your own conclusions about this perceived change in the hobby. So is this a real change in the hobby or just the nature of this type of show? Now I've been going to Salute for many years. If I remember rightly, my first show was Salute 2004 at Olympia, and one of my abiding memories of that day was seeing big historical battles taking place throughout the exhibition centre. There were other games there of course, but predominantly it was big scale historical games that seemed to dominate. And in the intervening years, including when Salute moved to Excel, there were often massive historical games to tempt the eyes and excite the heart of even the sternest grognard. And increasingly over the last few years we've seen a lot of really nice small scale games on little tables with a handful of figures per side, sometimes historical but just as often sci-fi or fantasy. Now that is not to say that there weren't any large historical games at this year's Salute. Ken Riley's 30 odd foot long Battle of Jutland game is probably the biggest table I have ever seen at any show. But also the Lardies put on a huge Stalingrad game for What a Tanker. And the best in show this year was a huge medieval naval game with dozens of ships and hundreds of figures across a table that must have been 12 or 14 foot long. Despite this, on the day I spoke to a lot of people who talked a lot about the perceived shift towards smaller skirmish games. Opinions seem to be varied, although as most of my friends are of a similar age, we're all harking back to earlier years and big battles we remember from past Salute shows. However, I've never been a rose-tinted glasses type of person, and I try not to let nostalgia pin me down in the past. Change is the one constant in our lives, and until someone reinvents the laws of physics, time only goes in a forward direction. We can try to influence the future direction of the hobby, but we should never try to hold it back from changing just because it's different to how we used to play. And if that forward direction of the hobby means more varied skirmish level games, and if that creates new wargamers, then so be it. Once these new gamers are in the hobby, then we, us old grognards, have a chance to interest them in historical games and eventually tempt them with the spectacle and the grandeur of big battles. Just because their route into wargaming is different from ours doesn't mean it's wrong. And towards the end of the day I sat and listened to one of the panel sessions. I did this primarily because that thoroughly fine chap Ken Riley was on the panel, but the topics covered were very interesting. Amongst other things, they discussed the wide variety of tabletop wargames and attitudes towards skirmish games versus big battles. And obviously Ken was in favour of big battles. After all, that's what his podcast is all about. And of course there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But from a personal perspective, I think it's quite possible to love playing big battles but also enjoy skirmish games and even shock horror non-historical genres. In the days after Salute, I've been reading a lot of posts about the show, watching other people's videos and of course reading the many comments associated with those videos and the video that I put out. Several people have highlighted the change that they had observed in the mix of games at this year's Salute. And this begs a question: is the change indicative of this particular type of large trade show or a reflection of a deeper change in the hobby at large? You know, high profile, large, single day shows like Salute do attract a lot of game design companies wanting to demo what their new game looks like and put it out onto the table, you know, to tap into that huge trading opportunity that the show represents. There are a lot of coffee table sized demos, nearly all run by companies selling or launching new games at the show, and these must inevitably compete for space with clubs running established games. But I think it is also true to say that across the hobby we've seen a boom in skirmish level games across all genres in recent years. There are lots of factors that may be driving this change, of course. Changing housing trends in the UK not only mean that putting a roof over your head is more expensive, but it's also likely to be smaller than that enjoyed by the generation that came before. Dedicating an entire room or loads of storage to a gigantic collection may not be within the means of everybody. Small skirmish games inevitably take up less room and they only need a small space to play on. There's also a financial element. Skirmish games may only require a few pieces of terrain, a mat and a handful of figures per side. And lastly, there's the time element. Life in general seems to be busier and more hectic these days. Balancing career, family duties, a myriad of household chores and finding time for hobbies as well can be challenging. The availability of free time to dedicate to a hobby will be different for everybody, and a game that doesn't require a huge time investment is much more likely to be a gateway for new or time-stretched gamers. Now, I think the changing composition of games at Salute is reflective of both factors. There is more of a trade show type element aimed at a broader hobby than there once was, but there's also the games being displayed are indicative of a trend within the hobby in general. Now, all this leads neatly to my thinking on the whole subject. Let me pin my colours to the mast and say that I will play any game, any scale and any genre. Indeed, amongst my many collections of figures for big historical games, I also have several skirmish collections, a lot of fantasy and even some sci-fi figures. So when I see smaller games at Salute, I'm not necessarily put off. Of course I have nostalgia for the good old days, but I'm not such an old fart that I can't accept that things must change, and will change, whether I like it or not. And while many of those small games have dedicated followings, many of their players will choose these games because they are quick, inexpensive and easy to store and play. Many players may only play one game, but many more will be tempted by other games and other genres. And it's for this reason that I look at these small scale games as the gateway drug of wargaming. One game leads to another, and with the right sort of encouragement and the right opportunities, many of these gamers could be tempted to the dark side to play historicals, big historical battles on big tables. In a way, today's subject links very neatly back to what I was talking about last weekend. With the right encouragement, support and collaboration, we will help those small scale wargamers to take the brave leap and become old grognards just like us. So we have a hobby update. Much of the last week has been spent recovering from the physical exertion of the Salute show. I've had a couple of extra days off this week of work this week, so I've been able to catch up with lots of correspondence and even get some painting done. A couple more buildings from the Slug Industries medieval village set were on my desk, and I've got one of them done, the windmill there, and I'll do some more over the next few days. Now, I didn't actually buy any models at Salute this year. In fact, I only came home with 2 rule books, which I'm hoping to do review videos of sometime in the next few weeks. The first book was Wargaming World, Ancient to Modern Solo Wargaming by Gregory Ward. I'm looking forward to reviewing this and see how I can incorporate the ideas into my own solo games. Now, I also bought a copy of the second edition of Lion Rampant. Now, I have to admit this was something of an impulse buy, mostly because I really like the rules by Daniel Mersey. But once again, I'm intrigued to read them, and hopefully sometime soon I'll do a flip through review for anyone who hasn't already got a copy. Now, with Salute out of the way, I'm finally turning my attention to the shows that I'm going to attend later in the year. Some are already firmly penciled into the diary because the rejects are attending or in force or running a game, such as at Broadside in Kent. Others may require a weekend trip away, and I may have to convince the wife to accompany me so that we can make a long weekend out of it. It all depends on other commitments, of course, but we're going to sit down with our diaries and work out a plan for the coming few months. Despite all the preparations for the Salute, the last couple of weeks I have been making a concerted spring clean of my operations room. I've been going through my storage and having a thorough tidy up. I seem to have kept tons of rubbish in the hopes that I might be able to turn it into a piece of terrain. And while some of it will be useful, much of it will probably never ever get used. So some stuff has gone in the bin, a lot has gone into storage in the loft. It's been a very useful exercise actually, because I've discovered that I have tons of resources and probably don't need to buy any more varnish for several decades. You know, as discussed in one of my recent videos, I won't be selling off anything that's painted, but I can at the very least rationalise my lead mounting and clear out some of the other detritus that just seems to have built up in this room. The last step for the coming weekend, or next weekend rather, is to pull out all my cupboards and clean the walls. You know, I mentioned before that during the winter months especially, the walls in here can get damp from condensation, and inevitably this leads to a little bit of mould. So a dehumidifier in here normally keeps that under control, but my one broke, so I've had a little bit more mould appearing on the corners of the room than I like, so I need to pull everything out so I can give it a damn good clean. So now that I've stirred up all manner of dust, I'm going through all my cupboards. All I need to do is pull everything out and wipe the walls out to freshen the room up. I know this isn't exactly exciting, but it is a job that needs to be done occasionally if I want to protect my terrain and figures in the best environment possible. Besides, while I'm doing that, the wife can't get me to tidy up the kitchen. So a very quick workbench update. With Salute out the way and the rejects settling back into our normal Monday paint and chat session on Zoom, I finally got some painting done, as I indicated earlier. So I've completed the medieval windmill from Slug Industries rather. I built this to complete at the end of the painting challenge, and then just failed to get any further with it. In the end, it took less than an hour to actually paint it, mostly with contrast paints. Now, with the paint flowing again and feeling a little less pressured in the coming weeks, hopefully I can get a few more small items completed. This building will go with my other 6mm buildings, primarily for use with my Wars of the Roses collection. So that's it for this week. I've rambled on a little bit, but I hope you've enjoyed today's video. Please join the conversation in the comments below. And if you did enjoy the video, please like, subscribe and share. It really does help boost the channel. And if you want to keep up to date with weekly content from the channel, please tap the bell notification icon. So until next week, stay safe, keep gaming, and of course, keep rolling high.